Dear friends, you're welcome to this other episode of the Beyond Africa podcast. On Beyond Africa, we discuss African issues and we look at Africans in the diaspora, Africans back at home, and African friends, how we can put ourselves together to transform the continent of Africa. It is our pleasure to always welcome you here, to hear your insights, and to see you actively participate in the conversation. So this is 2024. And in November 2024, the Americans are going to be electing the 47th president of the United States. A decision that could have far-reaching consequences on the world and Africa in particular. Meanwhile, as Americans are going to the polls to elect the new president, the anti-Western sentiment in Africa is growing and the United States is not left out. So, what can the Americans do to counter this anti-Western sentiment on the continent? In this episode of Beyond Africa, we explore how the outcome of the upcoming elections can either aggravate or mitigate the African anti-Western and anti-American sentiment which is growing on the continent. What can the African diaspora in the United States do to influence the 47th American president and his foreign policy, to ensure that America is not left apart, to ensure that the American foreign policy gains good ground on the continent of Africa? Otherwise, what should African Americans look for in the foreign policies advanced by the two candidates? The two leading candidates in these elections are Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Of course, it is a tale of a déjà vu. They have been there for 4 years each. What should Africans be looking for? When I come back, I'll introduce my guest to you. You're welcome to the program, Ambassador Tibor Nagy.
Thanks very, very much for having me. Sounds like some fascinating topics today, Bernard.
It's always fascinating when we have you around. You know, we know that you are dedicated to the continent of Africa. You've done a lot of work on Africa, and you still focus and concentrate on what is happening on the continent. And of course, we cannot skip an important moment like this without hearing your voice. We know that there is a growing anti-American, anti-Western sentiment on the continent, and at the same time, elections are coming up. Is it an opportunity to see how we could resolve this, how we could mitigate the anti-Western influence or sentiments on the African continent? And who else can tell us more about this? Who else knows Africa? And who else masters American foreign policy to the extent that he can advise Africans, especially the African diaspora that will be voting at the next American elections? Again, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I don't know who you're talking about, but it sounds like a very impressive person. Okay.
Let me tell you the person I'm talking about. The person I'm talking about is the former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. And before assuming that position, this person I'm talking about had served as a United States representative or ambassador in different categories in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, in Zambia, and in Cameroon. So maybe that person identifies himself at this particular moment.
Hey, Bernard, those are some really, really intriguing issues that you raised, and I think it's very important to talk about it. There's not going to be an easy solution, or, you know, when I say it's a solution, I'm obviously looking at it from the point of view of the West. And also I have to underline, I do not speak on behalf of the U.S. government because I am fully retired right now. So these are my personal opinions. As you said, there has been a very, very sharp anti-Western turn in Africa. The reasons for that are obviously historical, you know, going back decades to colonialism, but they're also unfortunately more recent because all of a sudden we're in a period of time when Africa has a choice, you know, as to who they're going to be dealing with. It's no longer you deal with Europe or America or Japan or, you know, maybe South Korea, but the Africans have a whole spectrum of international partners that they can deal with, so they can pick and choose. And it's a period of time where no one can take Africa for granted. Unfortunately, this is also mixed up with what I consider some real policy failures on the part of Western countries, including the United States, because with Africa now becoming younger and younger every year, and the young people are technologically sophisticated. They don't just listen to the radio or look at the newspaper. They can go online and see all types of information. And they see that some of the Western attitudes towards Africa have been extremely, extremely hypocritical. And I've spoken about this before, and I've written about it, that U.S. foreign policy, unfortunately, is tinged with quite a bit of hypocrisy, that we seem to hold sub-Saharan African countries to a higher standard than we do many other countries. You know, in Africa, we will talk about, a coup d'etat that cannot stand, whereas take a country like Egypt, when General Sisi becomes President Sisi, and the United States doesn't even call it a coup d'etat. So there's a tinge of hypocrisy that Africa's young people especially see through. So I really think it's very important, if the United States wants to turn away from this anti-Western sentiment in Africa, then we're going to definitely have to change how we treat with African countries.
Thank you very much for giving this broad introduction that touches on basically the critical points we're going to be talking about. And you highlight very critical issues that we're going to touch on them. We're going to pick on them one after the other. Now, it's election time in America, and you paint it as a situation that does not have an easy solution. But we all know it is grounded on foreign policy, historical foreign policy, colonialism, and all whatnot. But then at this material point in time, how important is the African diaspora to American politics? Do American politicians actually see the African diaspora as a critical constituency that can shape the American foreign policy towards Africa?
I don't think that as of yet all of the American politicians have recognized the critical importance that the African diaspora can play in U.S. elections. I'll give you an example. I have heard from a number of my Ethiopian friends that the Ethiopian diaspora is taking credit for the election of Governor Youngkin, Republican, in Virginia over a very, very close election, because the Ethiopian diaspora was unhappy at the time with the foreign policy towards Ethiopia of the Biden administration. So the critical importance, Bernard, is the diaspora united or is it split? And if it's split up, obviously then it's the sides will cancel each other out. But if there's an issue on which the diaspora is united, and if there is an impact in a local election, say, for example, Somali Americans in Minnesota, or Ethiopian Americans, say in Texas or in the Washington, D.C. area, and if they're united on a specific issue, then American politicians will start paying more and more attention to them. But it's critically important to make your voice heard. And if you don't make your voice heard, then you will be ignored.
Thank you so much for that clarification. But now going into the elections, and we cannot expect to have a homogeneous African diaspora. And we cannot equally expect to have a homogeneous American political class. They've separated. Even when you go to the Republican Party, it is still broken. You go into the Democrat Party, it is still broken. And they have different lines they follow. Without focusing on the unity or the unanimity of the African diaspora, what can the African diaspora actually do at this point to shape the American foreign policy? I know it's not an easy job, but without trying to be unanimous, how can they influence American foreign policy towards Africa?
I think there is one point on which there would be unanimity amongst every single diaspora group, and that is to say, pay attention to Africa. Because, let's be honest, as far as I can see, I mean, we'll watch the debate this Thursday night between President Biden and former President Trump. I will bet you that Africa is not even going to be mentioned in that debate. And I will bet you, having served as Africa policy advisor on several presidential campaigns, I will bet you that Africa will play an extremely minimal role in the upcoming presidential campaign, unless there's some major, event, usually a disaster that might happen. If something horrendous happens in Sudan or someplace else, at that point it may be a blip in the campaign. But most of the time, Africa it's going to be a non-issue as far as the campaign goes. And to change that, it is critically important for the African diaspora to make its voice heard. And it's not just the African diaspora, but it's the African American community. Also, you look at these other national communities, the Italians, the Irish, and others, they make their countries a point of priority in American politics. Can you imagine that if the African American community, which I forget if it's 12% or whatever percent of the American electorate, if they had a unified voice to say, okay, Mr. President, members of Congress, we want you to give priority to African issues. We want you to give priority to Africa. We want you to talk about African development. We want you to focus on African crises. Then the American political system would. But right now, there's Bernard. There's one good news about Africa. Okay, one good news. Africa in Washington remains as one of the very, very few bilateral issues. The people who care about Africa, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they get along with each other. Like, I'm going to be on a panel on Thursday for the Carnegie, endowment, and there's going to be 4 former assistant secretaries of state, 2 Democrats, 2 from Republican administrations, and we all know each other. We all get along. We all want the same thing. So, from the people who deal with Africa, it's not a matter of Republican or Democrat, because we all want to see Africa succeed. But to be able to have any political capital or any kind of influence in Washington, you have to have voters. And we see, one thing we do see in this election is that both President Biden, the Democrats always depend on the African American vote, but President Trump is making real outreach to Black voters. He was recently at a Black church, I think, in Detroit, because President Trump knows that his road to the White House, if he gets a larger share of African Americans than traditionally vote for Republicans, it's going to be a very, very close election. That could swing the election too. So this is an ideal moment when African Americans could step forward and say, we care about a lot of domestic issues, but foreign policy, we care about Africa. That is where, we originate from. That's where we came from originally. We want the American government to focus on Africa.
Thank you. I was going to ask if there is a need to differentiate between domestic issues in the United States elections and foreign policy issues in United States elections. And I think you've just touched on that. But one other thing I wanted to highlight is the fact you mentioned that you've served as the Africa policy advisor on different campaigns. When I was introducing you as the former assistant secretary for Africa, I was going to ask you, do you think you're coming back?
Who knows? That's always up to the president. The president makes those kind of appointments. So who knows? You know in my heart how much I care about Africa. So I'm always, open to serving in Africa. But again, that's totally up to, whoever is going to be in the White House.
I like the optimistic smile you started with. So let's hope that it happens when when the elections are done. So let's you actually mentioned the weight on which the African affairs lie in Washington, D.C. those who love Africa work towards Africa, and those who don't care about Africa actually don't care about Africa, and that is the reality of life. Now, the other countries, let's say the Italian community, the Chinese community, the Indian community, the Mexican community, those work as one country in relation to the United States.
Yeah.
Here, we often see Africa coming as a bloc. Is that not a hindrance to Africa, to foreign policy shifting towards Africa?
Yeah, it is. Bernard, I think you hit on a very, very important topic. I'm a Hungarian American. You know, I came here as a political refugee from Hungary. So I care a lot about Hungary, much more so than I care about all of Europe. You know, and especially now the African diaspora, they represent different countries. Ethiopian Americans care a great deal about what's happening in Ethiopia. African Americans, on the other hand, they don't have a direct pointer that goes back to Cameroon or Ghana or Benin or Togo or places like that. So in some respects, that is definitely a disadvantage, because they can't focus their interests on particular places in Africa. However, we all know that there is some commonality as far as the entire continent is concerned. So at a minimum, if the African American community just was a huge force for really calling the US government to account for not giving enough attention to Africa, then that would do it, because African Americans represent a huge block of votes. And as we know, in some states, it's 40, 50% of the population. So it's something that I feel that the community in the United States, the community of color, should be taken advantage of.
Yeah, thank you. Can we say American politicians do not pay so much attention to Africa because Africa is not geostrategically or geopolitically important to American interests?
No, I believe that Africa is very, very important to American geostrategic interests. But here's the deal. You know, the United States is a superpower. It is. And the United States has interests in every place in the world. So there's 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. You can only give attention to X number of issues. You know, there's some people in your audience who think, the Americans can pay attention to every single issue in the world all the time. And that's true. No, it's not true. For example, when I was Assistant Secretary for Africa, we could focus on, say, 3 or 4 issues at a time. And Africa has 55 countries, however you want to call them, count them. And you can't focus on things that are not of the primary importance. And that's true for members of Congress. It's true for the White House. It's true for the National Security Council. So who gets focused on? Two sets of issues. One, the issues that matter most to America's security in the world. And two, the issues that are raised by voters who have a lot of influence with Washington. So those are the 2 sets of issues that get focused on. And unfortunately, as you and I both know, with Africa, it tends to be bad news. It's not, everybody's not focused on, they should be, that Africa is the youngest continent, population is going to double by 2050. It represents tremendous potential for economic growth. Africa is the richest continent with all of the minerals and commodities that Africa produces. No, that's not what people focus on. People focus on war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, as far as international relations go, immigration in the United States, inflation, China, things like that. So to get attention paid to Africa, you need to make political noise. And political noise means, pushing issues through the diaspora, but also very much pushing Africa through the African American community.
It boils now down to the communication media that we can have, right? Because if we don't have access to Fox, we don't have access to CNN, we don't have access to MNBC and all the other media, how do you hear us? How do you hear us talk? Because we can talk amongst ourselves, we can attend council public halls, But at the end of the day, when there is no publicly generated noise for everybody to hear at the same time, the individual noise or issues raised at local levels tends to dissipate and disappear from the political spectrum.
Yeah, well, you know what, though? If you look and see how other groups have done it, say the Irish Americans or Italian Americans or even Hungarian Americans, you have affinity groups. You know, there's the Hungarian American Coalition, for example, and I know Italians have their, diaspora communities have their political action committees. And when you go into an office at Congress and you say, I represent 50,000 voters in your state or 5,000 voters in your congressional district, believe me, they immediately will pay attention and they will sit down with you and say, so what are the issues that are important to you?
So the message here is Africans should constitute themselves into affinity groups and into political action committees or groups to communicate with the politicians, and as such, their voices are going to be amplified if Africans actually want to generate that attention.
Absolutely. But the other important thing is, and we were talking about this before, is you can't come in with a 200-page manifesto. And unfortunately, some of the Africa diaspora groups love words. Love words, love long letters, love esoteric things that an American politician's eyes will glaze over. So the message has to be sharp, it has to be focused, and it can be, over, 200 different issues and places that no one's ever heard of. You have to be effective.
I can relate to that, and I know where you're coming from. I do, yeah. So, with that said, it's looking like okay. Let's put it this way: what is the role of the lobby firms in DC and New York? What is their role, and how do they influence government foreign policy?
Okay. From my point of view, again, this is my personal opinion. Lobby groups and firms are perfectly fine and they operate within the law. But I have found often that especially African embassies in Washington, they often get a lobbyist to do the work that they should be doing for themselves. Having been overseas at U.S. embassies, if we want to push a point of view, we do it ourselves. We make the appointment. We go see the members of the government. Whereas oftentimes in Washington, an African embassy will have a lobbyist go in and talk to members of Congress or people like that. But the lobbyists can be effective because they know how Washington works. They know who to go see. They know the members of the congressional staff. So yes, they do effective work, but they are not a necessity to getting your voice heard. Sometimes the organizations themselves are quite sophisticated and do it for themselves. Other times, they may be in Texas, and if they want to come to Washington, they may do it through a lobbyist. So organizations have to decide for themselves how best they can make their voices heard.
Thank you. And we get a comment here. Charles Nyikongi says, Africa would be delighted to have you back.
Well, that's great. I appreciate that from his lips to God's ears. We'll see.
That's amazing. And maybe he wants to ask you if you are actually advising any of the two campaigns at the moment.
I am engaged in one effort, which is kind of looking at the larger picture, but I don't want to talk about that right now.
That's understood. We can talk about that later. So let's get back to talk about the foreign policy and the Western anti-Western influence. I know you've mentioned the American double standard policy towards the rest of the world and Africa, but China is actually growing. China's influence is actually growing exponentially on the continent. And you have affirmed this in one of your tweets recently, where you said, due to American foreign policy and history and neglect, China has become Africa's most trading and investment partner.
Mm-hmm.
Would you at any point look at American policy as a strategy to Americanize Africa? And that is what is bringing a lot of pushback also from the continent, while the Chinese and the Russians come in with their own form of diplomacy without necessarily forcing Africans to adopt certain Chinese or Russian policies or ways of life.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. And I know that I have said before that, America in Africa, America gives lectures and the Chinese make deals. And we just have to stop that, because we seem to have this one model that we call, this is what a democracy should look like, when in fact, from my personal point of view, legitimacy in the eyes of the people is the most important criteria that you have to apply to a government. I mean, again, coups are not a good thing, but if you have a elected leader who all of a sudden will change the Constitution over and over and over again, or have elections which are absolutely fraudulent, and then they are eventually overthrown by a military, and the people go out in the streets and cheer that military, I think it's a mistake for Western nations to automatically say, oh, that's a horrible thing that happened. We have to cut our relations with those people. We're going to punish them, put on sanctions and all kinds of things, instead of saying, listen, the previous government was not in any bit democratic. There was no other way around this. So let's work with the new military regime and see what we can do to help them evolve towards a kind of a system that the people of the country will be happy with. I think that that's very, very important, instead of having this one size fit all model. And then when something happens, the best we can do is to show up with a megaphone and yell at the people that what they're doing wrong, and you can't trade with the Chinese, you can't do this, you can't do that. That's guaranteed. That is guaranteed to ruin relations.
And we are seeing that the ruined relations in Africa over the last years, especially with the coup d'etat in the Sahel. Yeah. There have been too many threats. You need to stop. You need to get back to a democratic government, but nothing is changing. And the three countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, they have not reverted to a democratic form of government, and the threatened sanctions have not come forward. So,
Bernard, this is not a secret, I don't think, but I would bet you that the people in those countries are much more interested in peace and stability than elections at this moment.
I would agree with that. There is a comment here from Mungongo. I think that is something we could address. What is your take on the recent development between the U.S. and the new authorities in Niger? I remember that the latter requested the U.S. military to leave the country.
Yeah, I think to me that particular instance exemplifies what I was just saying is wrong with U.S. policy. I think that the U.S. government, unfortunately, took a megaphone to telling the regime in Niger what it was doing wrong, what it should do, what it cannot do. And at that point, the soldiers in charge in Niamey said, thank you very much, United States. You can go home now. And that if the objective to criticize the coup government, or is the objective to help stabilize Niger, get the people peace and security, and then work with the government that's in charge to evolve towards a democratic system that will be acceptable to the people?
Yeah, and let's put it this way. If you were still in charge, what should have you done practically? I know we are all geniuses in hindsight, but what should have you done practically to kind of reduce the tension?
Okay, let's set something straight, Bernard. The Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the United States does not make policy. The Assistant Secretary recommends policy to the bosses above, you know, the Deputy Secretary, the Secretary, the National Security Council at the White House, because at the end of the day, it's the president's policy, you know, through the Secretary of State. So, you know, I can say, from my point of view, from having been familiar with Africa since 1978, I suggest you do X, Y, and Z, and they can either take it or leave it. So then they tell me what they want done, and you know, my choices are either to implement what they want done or to say I'm out of here. So you know, so that is the problem. Now, my suggestion would have been that it's in the interest of the United States of America to promote peace and security in the Sahel. So if these are the people that we have to deal with, we have to deal with them. We have to see where we can agree, and we have to kind of influence them towards, once we can get some peace and security, to say, okay, we're going to leave, go back to the barracks, and here's how we're going to do it. But again, I go back to the point. From my point of view, the critical element in all of these things is legitimacy from the eyes of the people. If the government in place is legitimate in the people's eyes, then we should deal with them. If the people consider the government totally illegitimate, then it's going to be a losing proposition going forward.
But how do you know if the people have determined the government to be illegitimate or
well,
legitimate?
You know, Bernard, our embassies, we have embassies in every country except, you know, a couple, and our embassies have a very good sense of what's going on the ground. You know, I can take a taxi ride in any African city, and I'll find out in 10 minutes exactly what the people of that country think of their government, much more so than going in and sitting down with the foreign minister who's going to give me the party line.
Mr. Ambassador, are you saying that elections sometimes do not matter?
Elections absolutely matter. But what's critically important is the type of elections. Because if, you know, for example, you know, give me a break. The last elections in Zimbabwe, did they really matter? Did we have any doubt of the outcome? How about in President Biya's Cameroon?
We are watching 2025 to see what is going to happen. Are you by any chance saying the elections in Cameroon are not credible, Mr. Ambassador?
I'm not saying that they're not credible. I'm just saying that we know who's going to win ahead of time.
Because the opposition is weak.
There are several reasons, okay? One reason you might have is that the opposition is weak and the opposition is divided, or if the opposition is stupid enough to not participate in the elections. But then you have the other case where the system is so rigged and the opposition leaders are all in jail that you know who's going to win ahead of time. I mean, in these elections, you know that Kagame's in, Museveni's in, Mnangagwa is in, Biya is in. Give me a break. You know, you've seen my tweets. I say the international community should save money. Why send election observers? You know, I went into this in Ethiopia when I was ambassador because the Europeans, who I consider very naive at times, we're talking about how many election observers they're going to send to the elections. And I said, you can send 1 million election observers. They can stand shoulder to shoulder. But if the government in place is unwilling to have itself voted out of power, then we already know what the outcome of the election is going to be.
Does that not, in a sense, say that Western powers actually influence and decide who is going to be the president of most African countries?
No, not at all. Not anymore. Once upon a time, I would say that you were probably right. But right now, I'll tell you who influences the outcome of elections in most African countries is the regime in place. You know, if President Museveni absolutely will not allow himself to be voted out, he's not going to be voted out. But then look at the recent South African elections. You know, I criticize South Africa all the time because of their foreign policy. But you have to look honestly at their internal politics. And, you know, the ANC took a beating. They admitted that they took a beating. And they went ahead and very, I think, wisely decided to form a unity government with people who philosophically they absolutely disagree with. So to me, that is quite a courageous step, as opposed to, yeah, let's get back to Zimbabwe. Did anybody think that Mnangagwa was going to be defeated? Give me a break.
So do you think Paul Biya is going to be defeated in Cameroon in 2025?
It depends. How old is he?
Does age actually matter here?
It does. We all have a shelf life.
But it's elections, and the person who is voted more wins the votes, and that's the president.
Yeah, the question is, who counts the votes?
Is that something that can happen in the United States also? Because 2016 highly questioned, 2020 highly questioned, and 2024 lots of tension in the atmosphere.
Yeah, there's lots of tension, but I'll be honest with you. In the United States, what I really like is with the United States federal system, elections are, even the national elections, really are conducted at the local level. And if the people who work in the polls are members of the community, you actually, you may know who they are. A lot of the times they're volunteers who are retired people who have done this over and over again. So there's a verification, system to look at the votes. So personally, I have absolutely no problems with how the 2020 elections turned out. But I know that a lot of people do. Even there are members of my own family who disagree with me, but myself, you had the presidential election come out in one direction, but at the same time, the Senate, people running for Senate and Congress in those same places were from the other party.
Absolutely.
So that, I mean, you know as well as I do. I mean, and where you're living, everybody tends to vote for Democrats, at least on the western part of the state. In the eastern part of the state, people vote for Republicans. Yeah. Where I'm living here in Arlington, Virginia, Republicans don't even need to run for office because they're not going to be elected. But my Texas home in West Texas, oftentimes there's not even Democrats on the ballot. So, it depends.
That is the paradox with elections. Sometimes the outcome is fixed, and sometimes it is a competition that could be as brutal as it can be.
Yep. And Bernard, you're bringing up a good point, because in the United States, most of the United States, there used to be genuine competition, but with each election, our elections are getting less and less competitive because, states, we say red states, blue states, and they're getting bluer and redder. And even though most of the people are independents, they tend to support one party or the other. So in a lot more places now, you don't have genuine competition, which I think is really bad, because competition means that you have to reach out to everybody instead of just your own, diehard supporters.
Yeah, and I think that takes away the essence of the elections, because elections are supposed to be about ideas, it's supposed to be about performance, it's supposed to be about what somebody can do and when we get so tied to politicians or political parties, it beats the essence, because we keep on seeing our party as the best or our politician as the best, even when they do the wrong thing. And that defeats the essence of a democracy to the extent that those who do not believe in electoral democracy or in Western democracy would actually question the essence of elections if we keep on repeating the same cycle. Maybe that is what is happening in Africa. In those countries, you say the elections are predetermined. Maybe people believe in those politicians already.
Yeah, and Bernard, that's why I'm a huge believer in the youth of Africa, because I definitely think that they're going to take Africa in a much, much more positive direction. We went through the era of the big men who were left over as, from freedom fighters and decolonization, who couldn't lose an election because the people genuinely admired them. But they're leaving the scene. As I said, everybody has a shelf life. And, hopefully now the young people will be looking for alternatives, and they'll be looking for ideas and looking at institutions as opposed to a person who they're going to vote for, immaterial of what that person represents.
Have you looked at immigration statistics from Africa recently, number of youths going out of the continent?
No, I did an article not too long ago about immigration problems in Europe, but I don't know what the numbers are. I mean, my point of view is that nobody wants to be a refugee or an immigrant if they have the opportunities in their home country. That, you know, to be forced to leave your home country is right away means that your country's not doing too well. So it would be good if, you know, that's another reason it would be really, really good if the countries which are incredibly, incredibly rich in Africa could put in systems that would keep their young people at home. I mean, you know, let's be honest, Europe needs immigrants. Whether they know it or not, they desperately need immigrants. They will find out at some point, because when you're 80 years old in Switzerland and there's nobody to take care of you, then at that point, you don't care what color or what religion or what ethnicity the person is, as long as there's somebody taking care of you.
Absolutely. And I think that should inform policy making when it comes to demographics and family, because if it continues in that way, then some countries may actually run out of human resources to keep them going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And yeah, this point brings me to a conversation about the leadership, the stability of the governments in African countries. Gerard Emmanuel has made a comment here, and he says a follow-up question to that of Mugongo. Do you, the Americans, might want to retaliate through some operation by the CIA, maybe organize another coup to overthrow the current regime? That should be about Niger.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, once upon a time, I mean, if you want to be honest, look back in the 1960s and parts of the 1970s, that kind of stuff happened. But, you know, after that, especially after President Carter, that doesn't happen anymore, you know, overtly, like the awful stuff that happened to Lumumba, the overthrow of the government of Iran going back, you know, 1950s, 1960s. No, that thankfully that era is long past. I mean, I remember that, of course, anything bad happened, it was always the CIA's fault. I was in Togo once where there were some socialist parliamentarians from France in northern Togo, you know, who said, oh, the CIA this, the CIA that. And I said, oh, yeah, there's a terrible drought here. And there's no doubt that the drought is the CIA's fault.
But we cannot take it that far back when we remember that Gaddafi was taken out. When was that? 2013?
Yeah, but that was the CIA. That was overtly done. You know, I mean, the international community interfered in Libya, and we can discuss and debate, you know, whether that was a wise thing to do or not. But it happened, but it wasn't a back room, you know, falling out of a window like all of President Putin's opponents do. They seem to fall out of windows in Moscow and St. Petersburg now, not in Washington or Paris.
But I want to talk about the opponents falling out of windows. But let's watch this clip from one of your colleagues in government. And I'm not sure he could join again if you are in that same government, but let's just watch him now.
Okay.
Attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but you know, other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did. It was just stumbling around from one idea to another. Ultimately, he did unleash the rioters at the Capitol. As to that, there's no doubt.
Yeah, what he's saying, I don't think John Bolton is so old to be talking about coup d'etats in the 60s, right?
I think he's pretty old, and I don't know what he's talking about. Somebody should have said, okay, tell us what exactly, or are you just saying that to make a point?
And even if he's saying that to make a point, he actually touches on some key issues I would like us to talk about, about oppositions being arrested, falling out of windows in Russia and other parts of the world. Some people actually argue that the treatment of the J6ers is actually opposition targeting. That the way the Department of Justice is treating them is like dictators would treat the opposition in some African or communist countries. What is your take on that?
Yeah, well, you know, that's the whole thing that we were talking about before, the huge ideological split amongst the American voters, where if people who believe that the elections here did not turn out the way that President Trump should have been, you know, declared the winner, obviously think that the J6ers were patriots. whereas other people who think that they were trying to stop the transfer of legitimate power, that in fact that they were trying to, commit some kind of a revolution. Myself, I am much more moderate in my view, because I don't think that they were trying to overthrow the government on the one hand, but on the other hand, you break into Congress when there's an important meeting going on, you're breaking the law. So, it's not one of those things where, you go out on that we should be executing those people, or on the other hand, that they did absolutely nothing wrong.
I think I like your nuanced approach here. And some other people would argue that people actually broke into the Congress too during the governor confirmation and some other activities, but they have not been given this kind of treatment. But let's move ahead. Do you think that African leaders, especially those who want to stay tight to power, would one day refer to the Trump prosecutions as an example of let the justice system do its job, and because this is all about justice, it has nothing to do with politics?
Yeah, well, here's the deal. I do a radio show in Texas every Monday, and we've talked about this on a number of those shows, because internationally, charging former leaders is not that unique. You can look at France.
Yep. South Africa.
Yeah, but the question becomes, is it a charge that is a result of a political process, or is it a charge that is a result of the judicial process? Now, the first trial for former President Trump in New York, a lot of people pointed to that one and said that out of the 4 possible trials, that was the government's weakest case. And it was done in New York by a very political district attorney, who basically said that he's going to get the former president. And what he did was he combined what are misdemeanors, what are lesser crimes, and made them a felony, which is a more serious crime. So that case, I don't think by any chance is over with yet. And we will just have to see how the appeals process, works out. But the nice thing is, in the United States, the judicial system is so, decentralized that it's not a tightly controlled judiciary like it is in so many Francophone countries. Because, under the Francophone system, the justices really are not that independent of the executive. Whereas in the United States, you can almost say that the third branch of government, the judiciary, is even more powerful than the other two, because they can say that things are unconstitutional, or
Absolutely, in some circumstances. But when I look at the fact that presidents actually appoint, and the appointments have become so political, as we have spoken about other elements, and we find people who are so strongly attached to the political views of a particular person or a particular politician and a political party being appointed to the bench, and some of them are prosecutors, making it a little bit questionable if they can actually guarantee their integrity. However, we are grateful that there are different stages where they are definitely, the decisions are going to meet people with different political or ideological reasoning, and through that process it can be sieved, and the political decisions brought in the judiciary can actually be taken out with the help of God. Let's hope it's going to be that way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a great point.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit cautious, because the lesson the people who want to stick to power in Africa would take is that if the opposition in the United States can be prosecuted and jailed during an election year, so too we can here, especially if they argue in the United States that let the Justice Department do its work, so too the judiciary in our country can do its work. So I'm a little bit here and there on this.
Yeah, we'll just have to watch and see what happens, how the processes unfold, because so far it's been one case that has been partially decided, and there's still more appeals to go. So we'll just have to see. I hope at the end of the process, I don't become cynical and say, that the United States has now also become a the kind of place that it used to not be.
Let's really hope it doesn't become,
Yeah.
and we maintain that degree of integrity and be the light that other countries can actually follow. So thank you very much. Let's continue. I wanted us to look at the next elections and what Africans, the African diaspora, the African American community, or those who are interested in Africa should be looking at in the two candidates and their political programs. Should they be looking at the candidate that is advocating for foreign direct investment in Africa, or should they be looking at the candidate that is advancing development aid in Africa? At this point, Africans want to emerge. They want development. So what should they be looking at?
My point of view,
without saying that this candidate is doing this, but what should they be looking at? Yeah.
No, my point of view is we should be looking at the candidate who is going to make the Africa's youth and how can Africa youth have a better life, and how can African youth have jobs that will keep them in their home countries and that will enable them to live the kind of life that they want to live. That, I think, is the most important thing. And because if you give African youth a job, the kind of job that will let them support themselves and their families in a comfortable way, then the other benefits will go with that as well. So that's what I would look at. Not, I am a true believer in humanitarian assistance. I am not so much a believer in development assistance, because I have to say that from my point of view, an awful lot of development assistance has not reached the people on the ground. That it goes to a lot of consultants. It goes to, universities. It goes into a lot of studies. I used to always say that on the ground in Africa, I could do more with $100 than I could with $1 million.
Yeah, and why do you think that over the years, since independence till today, we continue with the development assistance over the investment path, despite the fact that it's apparently, or it is not working, it's not changing the continent, it's not helping the continent move forward?
It's what we talked about before, Bernard, because there's a development lobby, and they know how to push the political buttons. And it's a lot easier for members of Congress to just keep the taps open than to deal with other things. I mean, I would put my resources into encouraging Western companies to invest in Africa and do the kind of investments that create jobs, not just the kind of investments that come in with a big shovel and take away Africa's minerals to be processed in Beijing. That would be my priority.
Yeah, with your experience working in Africa, and mostly everybody knows that you've worked in Africa and you understand African politics, you understand how African leaders think and the policies they put in place. Do you receive any requests from any companies who want to invest in Africa to kind of give them guidelines or advise them on what should be done or how they can go about it?
Yep, I certainly do. And I make a point, almost all of them want to hire me as a consultant, and I make a point to say that what I tell you is going to be free of charge. If I can do this as free of charge, I'm not going to take any payment for that, because it's something that I truly believe in. I'm not doing it for, I'm very happy with my life. I don't need additional jobs or anything like that. But yes, I do. I just spoke to somebody a couple of days ago about wanting to go into East Africa.
I think that's really important, because we need people who give the right advice. But when you give them free advice, do they actually consider it, or do they think that the free advice means you don't want them to make a profit out of Africa?
Oh no, they do want to make a profit. That's why people invest money, is to make a profit. But they do it because I do have some familiarity with Africa, and what I'm telling them is I tell them the truth. If I wanted a long-term job, I would sugarcoat things, but I tell them the way it is, or at least the way I see it.
Yeah. So we have this other question from Lazarus. He's asking if PEPFAR is a different narrative from ineffective development assistance.
Yeah, PEPFAR is not development assistance. PEPFAR for me is humanitarian assistance. That's something I used to hear all the time when I visited Africa, is that people would say, oh, look, the Chinese built this wonderful stadium. What has the United States done? I said, well, it's very difficult to show you the number of people who would be dead, but they're not dead because of PEPFAR. You know, the stadium would have lots of big cemeteries next to it with a lot of dead people, if not for PEPFAR. But I can't show you that.
Exactly. And that is a point you made earlier on, the difference between humanitarian aid and development aid. And we actually need to get a difference between these two, because humanitarian aid actually goes to support people who are in dire situations, while development aid is water production, agriculture, and all the rest. And sometimes what goes down, I agree with you that humanitarian assistance is very important, but for development, I think we should go the investment route. So this difference is necessary so that our viewers actually understand where we are coming from and why the United States continues giving humanitarian assistance, not only the United States, but the United States and her partners.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I don't know if development aid leads to jobs. Humanitarian aid leads to, saving lives and mitigating disasters. Investment is what leads to jobs, but it has to be the right kind of investment. Like I said, not just bringing in the bulldozers and digging up the dirt and taking it out.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the current trend of the transition from carbon fuels, fossil fuels, to the clean energy transition.
Sure. Hey, Bernard, also, we have about 10 minutes and then I have to go.
Awesome. Good. So let's talk about the transition. Previously, there has been the extraction of minerals from Africa for the development of industry in the West, all over the world. With the transition to the clean energy, are you seeing the trend, a possible trend that the West is going to ensure that there is the transformation of these resources, the critical resources within the continent, and then the processed resource goods are exported for manufacture abroad? Yeah, no.
From my point of view, this is where African nations should be putting their foot down. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and the treasures there, is to say, okay, yes, you can mine this cobalt, whatever, but it has to be processed here. It's not going to be put on a truck, taken to Mombasa, put on a boat, taken to Beijing or Shenyang or whatever, and processed there. It has to be processed here, or else we'll get somebody else to mine it. Because, as I said, Africa is in a phenomenally strong position, and they need to be taking advantage of that. Now, of course, everything is defeated if the leader, if the minister of mines or whatever is willing to take an envelope full of cash, and overlook the fact and give the contract and say, sure, dig it up, take it out. I've got my, I've got my lunch.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the biggest problems that is affecting the continent, where the policymakers, the decision makers, don't actually look into what is going to help the continent move forward. And at this point, I think it is necessary that Africans, especially those who are going to partake in the next elections in the United States, since we are in that context, look at possibilities of influencing American foreign policy, because America is is one of the leading countries in the just energy transition narrative, fight against climate change, to ensure that decisions that are being made to affect the climate change adaptation of strategies in Africa are actually Africa-focused and would lead to the development of Africa. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming. I know you're about to go, but there is
Cameroon.
There's one question I wanted to ask you, and that is from, first of all, I'm from Cameroon, and you know that, and I know you follow Cameroon very closely. So one thing I wanted to know is, you put a lot of energy and a lot of interest in the Anglophone conflict in Cameroon before you left office. And since you left office, it looks like the tempo has reduced from the United States side. And what regrets do you have? What could you have done at that time to lead to a solution that you think you might have not done?
It's on this one, I'm going to pass the blame to the Cameroonian community, because It was extremely frustrating as assistant secretary to have different delegations come and tell me that they represent the interim government of Cameroon, of Ambazonia. You know, as I said, you only have so many hours in the day and so much attention. So as long as the Cameroonian Anglophone community is split, and until they come up with some kind of unity as to what they want and how they want it, then the crisis is going to go on, and then the Cameroonian government has the advantage. I mean, I shake my head that there's still members of the Ambazonia community who think that United Nations Resolution 1608 is somehow magically going to deliver to them an independent Ambazonia. And I keep telling people that is a pipe dream. It is not going to happen. No one is going to deliver an independent Ambazonia on a plate to the Anglophone community. The Anglophone community has to be united. They have to be organized. They have to determine what they want and then forcefully articulate that. Otherwise, these arguments are going to be happening in another 20 years. That's the truth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for bringing out that truth, and that truth that is wrapped in 200 pages. And you have actually mastered the resolution that is being proffered out there, which shows that you are actually within the context of the conversations, and you still remember what was happening and what was being discussed at the time when you were in office. And I think this wraps up the conversation we've had about African Americans, the African diaspora in the United States, partaking in the elections to change policy. There needs to be unity. There needs to be an understanding of what Africans want and how they would want the United States to play a role. I don't think we are calling on the United States to come and colonize Africa or to come and take over the management of Africa. We are simply saying that the United States can influence decision-making because the world is interrelated. Am I wrong, Mr. Ambassador?
You are absolutely right. Africa does not need fixing. Africa needs to be given its proper role in the century.
With that, thank you so much for coming to the program, Mr. Ambassador, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much, Bernard. All the best. God bless you. God bless Africa.
Thank you. Let's meet in the background before you go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the program. Thank you so much for joining Ambassador Tibor Nagy and I to discuss Africa, American politics, and what we can do to influence American foreign policy towards Africa. And on that note, see you next time for another interesting and insightful conversation that would be geared towards moving Africa forward. Bye. See you next time.